So the next question is actually quite an interesting question. I personally don't have the answer to this, but it's thought-provoking. Now, when landlords enter into lease agreements with tenants, obviously the landlord takes a deposit. Most of the time, the landlord takes a deposit, and if he does, the legislation requires the deposit be deposited in an interest-bearing bank account, like a savings account, and that interest is accrued in favor of the tenant. And no one's ever really raised an issue with this because no one's thought about it. But in this particular instance, the agent is asking the question, but if the tenant is of Islamic faith and interest should not be accruing to this tenant, what does the agent/landlord do?
Perfect. So thanks, Bruno. I'm glad you said at the start that you might not know the answer, because this is one of those interesting moments. You know, we obviously come on every week and we give answers to questions that we know, but the way the law functions is there are questions we just don't know sometimes. And these are the things that courts are there for, to flesh out what happens in certain circumstances where we don't have a clear answer. And this is really one of those, a great question, because it's something I also sit there and I go, well, I don't know. So let's just break down exactly what the difficulty is here. We obviously have a residential property, and that is governed by the Rental Housing Act, as we all know. And there are a number of provisions in the Rental Housing Act that we have to take cognizance of and abide by. Now, the first most important one, which I just want to lay out, which I don't think we've mentioned on the channel before, is at the start of the Act, where the Act says that no person, no landlord can discriminate against a tenant based on a variety of factors, race, ethnicity, belief, and religious belief religion is specifically mentioned in that particular section. So that's off the bat. This should be something that's well understood, but it is legislated in any event that you can't discriminate against any tenants on that basis. So that's the first thing. And then the second provision that we need to look at is obviously our classic Section 5, which deals with provisions that are deemed to be part of a lease agreement. And one of those provisions relates to the deposit. So a landlord may ask for a deposit in terms of a lease agreement, but if they do ask for that deposit must be invested into an interest-bearing account on the tenant's behalf in the circumstances. And we have now gone through the legislation again just before we hopped on here, and unfortunately that section is peremptory. There's not an option that the landlord has in that regard. They must do it in terms of legislation. And then lastly, it must be remembered that that particular provision, that a deposit must be invested into an interest-bearing account, also cannot be waived in terms of the legislation as well. So in terms of this particular question, it's fascinating because we are in a position where the landlord really doesn't have an option. In terms of legislation, he is required to take certain actions, and part of those actions includes, if you are going to take a deposit, investing it into an interest-bearing account for the benefit of the tenants. There's no way that the landlord can agree or contract out of that particular legislation. You normally wouldn't, but this act is very specific about the fact that you cannot do such a thing. So it's a fascinating question in the circumstances. I'm not sure I have the answer very crisply. I'm not a religious expert. I'm only a legal expert in the circumstances. So I'm not sure from a religious perspective whether there are ways around this. From the landlord's perspective, my advice would be, look, in order to not fall foul of the law in the circumstances, you're going to have to invest that into an interest-bearing account. What I would hope in the circumstances is there is some way in which the tenant can see their way to perhaps not taking the interest. As my limited knowledge of the religious beliefs, you're not entitled to unfairly benefit, and it's sort of fair exchange is the idea. So maybe the deposit can be, even though it is invested into an interest-bearing account, the interest itself doesn't accrue to the tenants in the particular circumstances, and when the deposit needs to be appropriated or paid back, the capital amount is all that is on the table in the circumstances, and the interest accrues to something. I would really wait or expect someone who's more of a religious expert to figure out how exactly that would work in the context of the religious script. But in those circumstances, regardless, what I think would be important is, please, if you are the landlord in this particular circumstance, or if you're getting into a transaction where this happens, get that agreement that has been reached between the parties in writing. It's got to be sitting in writing, so that you can actually reflect what exactly the agreement is between the parties, and why. If interest is going to not be taken by the landlord or taken by the tenant, something else is going to happen with it. Make sure that you've got that well documented to say this is what's going to happen, and this is the reason that it's going to happen in the circumstances. So it is really a fascinating question. I don't think I have a clear-cut answer, Bruno. I know we discussed before. I think both of us sit here and say, well, I don't think there is a clear-cut answer. And it's fascinating. Every now and then, as a lawyer, you come into a question where there isn't an answer, and it's potentially a constitutional issue where you've got what you want and what you need is ultimately a court to sit down and go, well, how do we grapple with this question in our constitutional democracy? It's unfortunately probably one of those questions that's never going to really sit in front of a judge, because we're talking about just a deposit on a rental agreement of a couple of $1,000. So it's very unlikely it's going to sit in front of a judge for a constitutional determination, but it is an interesting question in any event.
Thanks so much, Nick. I'm actually going to ask around and see if any attorneys, especially of Islamic faith, have actually experienced something like this before, and we can maybe try and give it another shot next week.
It would be a great follow-up question. I'll reach out to some of my attorneys as well. Maybe we can get someone on to sort of grapple with the idea a little bit more.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks so much, Nick.
Perfect. Thanks, Bruno. We'll see you next week.
Cool. Cheers.
Yes.
Yeah.